Academica Media. From Academica Media Studios in Miami, Florida, it's Big Ideas in Education, a weekly recap of inspiration and innovation in your schools.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Big Ideas in Education. I'm Sarah Boulos from Somerset Academy Schools, and I'm joined, of course, by my co-host Ryan Kairalla of Doral College. Hi, Ryan.
Hi, Sarah. How's it going?
Going well. Hello, everybody. We're excited to get to our stories for this week. Ryan, what do you have for us?
Well, I got a great article, Sarah, that came out on February 3rd on Education Week from psychologist and fellow UPenn PhD, Sarah, Angela Duckworth. She's a minor alum.
She's kind of a big deal. Yeah. If you've never heard of that name, you may have heard of Grit. She's the author of that.
She is the big grit proponent, but I actually have an article from hers that does not talk about grit, if you can believe it. Yeah. She talks about in this article, really terrific piece of writing, about the importance of encouraging teamwork to build competence and confidence for students in the classroom. In Dr. Duckworth's article, she talks about a college physics class that has students completing assignments a little more collaboratively than one would expect. After noting that the students in his class were having trouble understanding basic course concepts from traditional lecture-based instruction, the class's professor, Eric Mazer, redesigned his course entirely to have his students work in groups to collaborate on solving open-ended, real-world physics problems. And the traditional solo assignments of the class, as well as the class's end-of-course final exam, were eliminated. And according to Dr. Duckworth's article, Professor Mazer found that the new instructional approach had several benefits. First, it boosted students' self-efficacy and eliminated the gender-based self-efficacy gap that tends to be commonplace in physics classes. Secondly, having his students work together to solve real-world problems served as good practice for the professional workplace, since that's pretty much all we have to do. And it seems like each day is working together to solve problems. In the end, Professor Mazer became a convert to a more collaborative learning environment. Quote, "During this difficult time, there is no shortage of problems to solve. There are meals to cook and neighbors to help. Perhaps when our young people work together for the greater good, they will teach us adults a thing or two along the way." I get really interested with articles like this because it hits a lot of marks for things that I'm passionate about as an instructor, Sarah. Project-based learning, group learning, having the class environment replicate what we have to do every day in the working world, as opposed to what the day-to-day classroom experience is like for most students, which bears little resemblance to what the outside world is going to be like for them. So I dig it. I love it. And I think in the increasingly virtual classroom environment and our continued reliance on things like Google Docs and Google Sheets, which are all collaborative, I think virtual learning is particularly conducive to this kind of group-style work.
Absolutely, Ryan. That's the first thing that came to my mind, too, is that this sounds a lot more like project or problem-based learning, which we've discussed on the show before. But problem-based learning has a lot of proponents because of just the fact that it mimics, like you said, what happens in the real world, even though I don't love that term. But in the working world, I guess would be a better way of putting it. When we have situations where we are collaborating on solving problems, and most fields, I should say, you're not on your own. You're not sitting in a room where you're solving problems. This is a really silly math meme that was floating around a few years ago, but it's like what math teachers want you to believe. It's like your boss comes into the office and says, "Hey, we're going to lose this client if you don't do this math problem and solve and show all your work." Like in the real world, that's not exactly how it happens, right? Where you have to really come together with different people and different perspectives and try to come up with solutions that are going to be workable. And part of that is failing. And part of that is realizing that these things don't always go together. And so how do we come up with a different approach, and dealing with a diversity of perspectives and personalities and approaches? And that's really crucial to success, not just in a classroom in this, kind of sheltered environment, but in the working world at large.
Let me get your perspective on something as an educator, Sarah, that I know that I struggle with when assigning group work, and I know other instructors do as well. And it's the idea that even though we encourage students to do work collaboratively, and all instructors see the merit in that kind of work, we still have to grade students individually. It's just a central tenet of our system. That's how we evaluate students. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way, but it is how our schools are built. And I think group work does create the potential of free riders, as you would might call it, students who don't effectively contribute, or students who feel like they're doing more work than other students, or just how do you evaluate collective work on an individual basis? And I have my own thoughts on that in terms of things I've seen work and things that I've seen don't work, but I'm interested in your perspective. Have you ever assigned work like this in the past and have come up with some good tips on how to individually evaluate students on a collective project?
Yeah, I think that's something that many, or if not all, new educators kind of dread is, okay, I have this great idea, I have this great project, the kid's going to learn a ton, but how do I assess them? How do I grade that? How do I make sure that I'm being fair? So there are a lot of different approaches to something like that. For example, sometimes teachers will give both an individual grade and a group grade, so that there's something for the product that is being produced, for lack of a better term, but then also the individual work that goes into it. Sometimes, and this is very popular, of course, with literacy educators like myself, they have different roles assigned within a group. So students are given a rubric. They're told this is what your role is in the group, or at least your responsibilities, which is also mimicking, I think, more what the working world looks like. Yes, we're responsible for the project that we're on, but there are also very specific roles that we take on in our jobs that we are responsible for. So giving students really clear understandings of what their role is within that group is really beneficial, because anytime that you just give out, a lot of here's an issue and solve it. Yes, it's an opportunity for learning and for growth, but some direction may be needed, especially if this is maybe the first time you're doing something like that. Providing rubrics, providing opportunities for students to understand what their job is within that group, what their role is and how they should be performing and how they're going to be assessed is really critical to them understanding not only what the project is about, but their role in it. I know I said role like 50 times, but it's a really critical part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Are you a fan of peer evaluation as a way to individually assess students and potentially ferret out free riders in the group work process?
I think it can be. It depends completely on what the project is and what they're supposed to be doing. I also think that the level of, hands-off attitude that the educator plays within the project is really interesting. It depends, again, on what the product is. So if we're talking about in this example that you gave, a physics problem where they're working out different, I think it's probably easier for the teacher to see in the classroom what's going on, who's contributing, at what rate, I think that's easier to see. When we're talking about things that take you outside of the classroom, maybe in the virtual world or something where students are expected to work outside of the classroom, it's a little bit more difficult. And you might say, okay, you're going to be graded on your own work. You also are going to maybe rank, the participation of your colleagues and your coworkers in this group. And whether the teacher uses that as part of a grading mechanism, I might hesitate with that a little bit. I mean, it's feedback and it's interesting, but I think the teacher needs to have clearly established what the grading criteria will be before going into that project, without taking into consideration necessarily, of course, exceptions always happen or something interesting might come up. But I think the educator needs to be responsible for the grading criteria before they go into the project.
I did appreciate your perspective about the importance of a teacher making that investment in the front end, that even in the area of group work, if a teacher takes some time to set clear roles for each student, clear expectations for each student, that can help sort of make sure that students still carry a sense of individual responsibility for their mastery as part of the project. And we've done 106 episodes of these, so I'm not 100% sure, but I'm almost positive we've covered some variation of that topic of assigning roles in group projects before. We might have to go deep into the archives for it, but I'm almost sure.
It sounds like something we may have talked about before.
I feel like at this point, everything we've done has to be us taking a second lap on it at this point. Although
I think there are always things that come up that are new.
Well, and in that regard, I'm pretty sure the story you have for us this week, Sarah, is pretty cool and groundbreaking, and I was interested in hearing about it, and I know the listeners will be as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Many of you may have heard of the Pulitzer Prize-winning 1619 Project, which challenges us to reframe U.S. history by marking the year when the first enslaved Africans arrived on Virginia soil as our nation's foundational date. That being, of course, in 1619, and that happening in August of 1619. That date is significant, of course, because most of us think of the founding of our nation as somewhere around 1620, right, with Plymouth Rock. So this project was started by journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones in August of 2019, which was the 400-year anniversary of that. And since then, the Pulitzer Center has provided incredible lesson plans, resources, and curricula for educators to work with their students on learning about this. Now the Pulitzer Center is announcing an initiative to include educators more closely with this project by launching the first cohort of the 1619 Project Education Network. As part of this paid virtual program, a cohort of 40 education professionals will receive grants of $5,000 each to support exploration of key questions of racial justice and other pressing issues in a community that also includes award-winning journalists and the Pulitzer Center education team. This exciting opportunity is open for educators to apply until March 15, 2021. I think this is a really incredible opportunity to learn more about this project and also to get educators' input. What are your thoughts on this, Ryan?
Man, this seems so cool, so important, and I can't help but draw some parallels between your topic this week and your topic last week about Holocaust education, talking about two powerful, tragic eras in the history of our nation, the moments preceding it, and the importance of making sure that we take the right steps in teaching these things effectively. Now, I don't know if you hit on this in your intro, but I would imagine that a lot of the same things that you'd want to do with Holocaust education would apply here as well. A K-12 approach to make sure that this isn't something that's just taught in one part of one class of one grade level, but is integrated across the curriculum. And speaking of integration, making sure you have that second component of making it multidisciplinary. Something like the Middle Passage, the history of slavery, shouldn't be confined to social studies class. And you did a great job of identifying and calling me out on that last week, that there are contributions to be made in literature, in the sciences, in these fields to really help illuminate this part of history, making sure that students understand and absorb its lessons.
Well, I think it's especially interesting now that we're in February. It's Black History Month. And I think that it was last year when it might have been last year. I'm starting to forget if it was last year or the year before. But I think I did encourage us last year to really think about the fact that obviously Black history is not something that should be taught only in February, right? This is something that is part of American history and is not something that we should be focusing only on firsts or we hit the high notes. We've got Rosa Parks, we've got Martin Luther King Jr., and that's it. And that's really what something like the 1619 Project is about, is really understanding how, in a lot of ways, Black history and enslaved Africans have been taken out of the narrative about American history and about how we were formed as a nation. So it's really interesting to go into these resources and to see that them inviting educators to say, how do we bring this to students in a more appropriate level? How do we make sure that this project is coming into classrooms with the resources that teachers need to be able to have these conversations? I mean, we've also talked about the fact that it's very difficult for educators to have conversations about racist systems, about social injustices in general. So preparing educators for this is not just a cool idea, it's really necessary. It's necessary because providing resources without helping educators to understand how to have these difficult conversations in the classroom is irresponsible, because you're opening up a wound, really, without giving them the tools to say, how do we bring the adults together to talk about this? How do we bring students together to talk about this in a way that's going to be beneficial, healing, and helping us to move forward?
Without resources like this, it can be very difficult for teachers, particularly ones that don't have firsthand experience of, a lot of the legacy of the Middle Passage, 1619, and slavery. And so a lot, without those kind of resources where teachers feel comfortable teaching this material effectively and with heart and with sensitivity, teachers will often default to the achievement-based approach to Black history, right? Let's talk about Martin Luther King. Let's talk about Lewis Latimer inventing the carbon filament for a light bulb, and then hopefully we get to the end of the month. And those achievements are important to discuss, but if we want to give students a real appreciation for the legacy of slavery and how Africans were treated throughout the centuries of our history, like that, you need to get to the difficult subjects. And so I commend the New York Times 1619 Project for creating resources like this to allow educators to have that comfort. And it's a positive first step. And I look forward to checking out a lot of these resources that you have, Sarah.
Absolutely. And if you are an educator who's listening to this and wants to learn more about it, we're going to put all of the information in the description box. And again, the applications are only open through March 15th. So if you're listening to this, you still have about a month to get that. Well, if you're listening to it when it comes out, I should say, you still have about a month to learn more about this and to get an application in. Ryan, I'm so excited that we've had this opportunity to have this conversation today, and I hope that others will want to join this conversation. So if you're listening and you want to engage with us, please reach out to us on social media. You can use the hashtag BigIdeasInEducation on Twitter. You can reach Ryan at Ryan Kair. You can reach me at ReadWithFye, that's FYE. And we're glad to have you, and we hope to continue this conversation. Have a great week.
The views expressed on the preceding program have been those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of Academica, its clients, staff, affiliates, or advertisers.